This video has been a long time coming. The Primary Arms PLxC in second focal plane featuring the NOVA reticle. When I reviewed the SLx NOVA
Pew 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 pew.
a couple of months ago now,
Pew pew pew.
it blew me away by its overall base performance. What I mean by that is it offers so much to the table for such a very cheap price. And like many of you, I wondered how good could Primary Arms make that scope if it was just made in Japan?
Pew pew.
Well, it's not a 1-to-1 comparison because this is still a 1-to-8, not a 1-to-6. And to me,
Pew pew.
I think that's the only real issue I have with this scope. But
Pew.
let me explain myself in greater detail. The first focal plane PLxC in 1-to-8 is nearly perfect, but it suffers from very tight eyebox syndrome,
Pew pew.
as well as the glass being overstressed.
Pew pew pew.
But can this fix any of those
Pew pew.
issues at all? Well, let's find out.
Congratulations! You've decided to buy a Primary Arms Platinum Line Compact 1-to-8 lpvo, but you have a question. Do I go with the first focal plane version or the second focal plane version? Well, if that's a question that's rattling around inside your brain, this is the video for you, my friend, because we're going to look at these two ad nauseum. The first focal plane, PLxC as it's now referred to, has been a staple of this channel for quite some time. It's been a workhorse for me. It's gone on many different rifles over several years, and it has performed flawlessly. It's not without its quirks and its limitations, however, but I do believe that people are looking at this scope and seeing the limitations a little bit backwards, but more on that very soon. Primary Arms saw it fit to make a second focal plane version of their beloved PLxC, and why not? This first focal plane version already performs very high, all things considered. So shouldn't the second focal plane version perform even better than that? Because technically the glass should be doing less work. Primary Arms also saw it very smartly to put their Nova Bright illuminated reticle in this thing. And I must say, I really love the Nova reticle and illumination, whether it's on this or their budget model SLx. However, which one of these two Japanese-made, very high quality, very well-built LPVOs is going to be right for you? Well, to answer that question, why don't you come on in a little bit closer? We're going to take a real quick look at these two physically and see what sort of differences there are, if any.
This was originally going to be a standard style review, and then I was going to introduce a full-on comparison between the first focal plane and second focal plane versions. But then I just realized I could roll them both into one video and just make it a little bit more streamlined for all of you at home watching and wondering how good this optic really is. Well, if you are familiar with the first focal plane version externally, it is the exact same, with the exception that it's a little bit shorter. Primary Arms on their website claims it's only 0.08 of an inch shorter, and that's not too far off. It's just shy of 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125, not 0.08. Beyond that, everything is exactly the same. I'm very happy that they sent me the FDE versions. This way I could showcase how nice it is. I really like how it looks. I think it's a very nice color and would complement a lot of accessories, mounts, and guns that have the option of coming in FDE. And if you're like me, you'll love anything other than black just to change things up a little bit. As far as the weight goes, theirs and yours makes no difference the same. They're in the exact same ADM mount, so that basically negates that added weight. These really are twins. They're the exact same, but one's in first focal plane and one is in second. My biggest hope for the second focal plane version that it already improves upon the already excellent qualities of the first focal plane version. But does it? Well, let's find that out together. The turrets are excellent. I was wishing that the first focal plane version would have exposed locking elevation turrets, but on the Nova reticle, you set it and forget it and use the drops. So for this, it's actually even better.
PLxC.
Despite the fact that this is a set and forget style of optic, I still throw it on my tracking test setup and run a real quick test. And because this is in mils, I can genuinely see if it works properly. I sped this up because many of you aren't really going to care about it. As long as it goes to where you want it to and it stays there, that's all you're really going to care about, and understandably so. But if you're the type of person that still wants their stuff to work as good as possible, you'll be delighted to know that this thing tracks better than most scopes, really. When I dial up to 10 full mils, I basically get 10 full mils. It's a little bit hard to see, only being 8x here at 41 yards, but I'm very impressed by how this thing tracked. As far as slop to the erectors, there's nothing on the windage that I was able to notice. On the elevation, it seemed like maybe there was a half of a tenth of a mil, but it was so hard to pick up that it's just a wash. So tracking wise, this thing was very solid. I had the scope for some time. Primary Arms gave this to me early in the spring, and I was fixing to get it all set up and done in time for its original launch, and life happened, so I got mega delayed. But I've had this scope for a very long time, and I really ran it through its paces alongside its first focal plane brother and many other LPVOs. The one thing that I can say I had an issue with was consistency with the eyepiece. I would tweak it here and there, and I'd get it really good in one aspect and kind of mediocre in another. This is about as good as I possibly got it. You can see when panning across these trees, there's very little shifting going on as far as where the trees are lining up. There is a little bit of fisheye, and you will notice it in different environments a little bit more because, again, I had tweaked this thing several times. It's not terrible, but it's still not better than what the first focal plane version is. The first focal plane 1X is really, really, really good. It still has a minor bit of distortion, but this has the exact same amount of distortion. It also has the exact same tight exit pupil, 8mm to 3mm, 1X to 8X. Both the first focal plane and second focal planes are identical in that aspect, and they should be. They're the exact same size, weight, and glass. The only difference is we don't have an extra lens in between that's moving along with the magnification that has the reticle in it. And does that play a factor? We're going to be finding that out very soon. But here, you can at least tell that the image stability on this scope is pretty good, meaning when we start jockeying the camera around the outside of the scope, you can see that both the image and the reticle maintain a very good level of sharpness. And that illuminated reticle is just gorgeous, gorgeous. The fiber dots are just, they're every second focal plane optic in the world should have fiber dot illumination. I don't care who you are or what you say. That should be written in law somewhere. Getting behind this thing, you can really have a really tremendous looking image and very little scope body. It is wonderful. On par with the first focal plane for, I'd say, about 90 to 95%. I still think the first focal plane is a little bit better at the extremes, but we're really splitting hairs at that point. It's wonderful. It really is wonderful. To give you a more dynamic sense of how tight the Eyebox is on this thing, here we are at 1X, and you can see we hit those shadows rather quickly. And when we choke up on it or pull back from it, it doesn't seem as bad, but shifting side to side really comes up quick as far as your limitations. Roughly at 4X here, and you can see it dramatically tapers off. This is very similar with what we had with the first focal plane version. And this is something that I was hoping beyond all hope would be more improved over the first focal plane version. I have my reservations, but I still think that this scope makes a little bit more sense than first focal plane, and I'll be explaining that further on throughout this video. But at 6X here, it's downright challenging to get behind it just right, at least freehand with the camera. You can still do it, but it's nowhere near as easy as it ought to be. And at 8x, it's downright challenging. You could still perceive a very good image when you're perfectly behind it, but you really have to maintain a very high level of concentration to make sure that you stay behind it perfectly. And that's this thing's biggest issue. At least that's what the biggest issue I have with this thing is the very tight eyebox. Its low light performance is also pretty good. Here at 1x, you could see that there is a little bit of brightness drop off, but it's so minimal that, again, a couple of percent maybe, and it's really splitting hairs. But are you really going to be running this thing really late at night? And if you are you going to be using its maximum magnification? Well, if you decide to use your maximum magnification, does it at least not get any worse? The illumination, way too bright on its brightest setting. This is around halfway through its overall capacity for illumination. I really like the Nova reticle. It's so easy to pick up at 1x, or any x for that matter. But it's just a wonderful, wonderful reticle. As far as how this thing looks at 8x, though, you can see it not only gets really dark, but that really tight exit pupil makes it extremely challenging to get a good view looking through it. I adjust the camera to make sure it wasn't on my end, but no, at 6 to 8x, very similar with what we see with the first focal plane version, it completely falls flat on its face. At 6x right there is the absolute maximum I'd be willing to take this thing in lower light environments. And even then, it's more challenging to the naked eye than it is with the camera. And the reason for that is, as it gets darker, your iris gets larger and it can dilate larger than what the minimum exit pupil is, and thus you get really weird shadows. No bueno. As a little treat, I'm going to roll in some footage from one of my behind-the-scenes videos that I submit to my paying subscribers on Patreon and Subscribestar. Like I said, I ran this scope a lot, and I wanted to give you some off-the-cuff information as I use it.
The reticle is very easy to pick up. The only thing I could see possibly being an issue for some people is the first line is very wide, and you might confuse that for the actual center line of the reticle. But you could train around that. Muscle memory on this gun I'm a little rusty with, so I'm not as perfect as I should be. I pulled that one. But it seems to be very good. There is some fisheye going on to this lens at 1x, in fact a lot of it. But even just panning across, you could notice it. But if you're going in really fast transitions, you don't notice it anywhere near as much. But we do hit off the shadows on the scope pretty hard. Let's do another couple of rounds, this time with the illumination on. And I think 10x is going to be just bright enough. Definitely red dot daytime bright. Let's see if it makes me any faster or better to get on target. We'll start with the 1-2. I rushed that shot, I hit the right shoulder, but the illumination is very nice. Illumination is very, very nice. Of course, I'm wearing sunglasses. If I was not wearing sunglasses, the illumination would be too bright, but I would just step it down to 9 or 8 as opposed to 10.
I make a very valid point in that segment. No matter what you run, gun, optic, setup, whatever, you can still train around a lot of it. If something doesn't work for you, though, to the point where you have a real hard time using it, change it up. Give something else a try. Tweak something. You might be surprised at what you get. But with this, its minor shortcomings are still very easy to get past. I said earlier that I had it perfectly dialed in at my backyard, and here at the power towers, you can see with the diopter set ever so slightly off, now all of a sudden it exhibits a lot of distortion and warping to the image. As we pan across the legs on those power towers, you could see it just like it shifts off a little bit. whereas before everything was lined up perfectly. I don't know why it was so extreme in this example, but it was very apparent. It's something that you can't really unsee once you see it. However, at 1x, it is very sharp and very clear from edge to edge. And again, that NOVA reticle is just, oh, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It gives a lot of information without being cluttered, without being clumsy. Ah, it's very nice. Very, very nice. As we slowly take the magnification up to its maximum here at about 500 yards, just keep an eye on how sharp everything looks. That was one major complaint, maybe the most major complaint with the 1:8 first focal plane, was above 6x, the image fell off to become almost useless. But here, ooh, does that look good? It is a very sharp, good-looking image, very minimal chromatic aberration. It has pretty good contrast, pretty good colors, and has a fairly good overall one-to-one representation about what we actually see downrange. It could be better, though, because, again, this is with a perfect cheek weld setup. If we were to shift it over just a little bit, it just completely becomes impossible to use. So if you're using this thing at any sort of distance and you want to use the drops in the reticle, you have to be at 8x because it's the second focal plane. And yes, the image is tremendous. You can absolutely see your target. But if you don't have a 110% perfect cheek weld, you're not really going to be using it all that much. And again, if you're in lower light environments, the exit pupil gets so small that your iris might dilate a little bit too big, and now you can't really see through the scope at all at 8x. And if you're using those drops, you have to be at 8x. So that's the biggest issue I have with this scope. It almost seems half-baked. Like, this could be so much better if it was just a standard duplex and you're like, okay, you're going to run a battle zero of like 5200, 36,300, and then just hold. But it irks me with this. It just bothers me a little bit. You could see just how fast those shadows creep up, being slightly off center. And again, to the naked eye, it's so much worse. At 6x, we do have a bit more forgiveness, but nowhere near to the point where it's like, okay, I could really get behind this thing and feel comfortable in almost any sort of environment. It's disappointing. I guarantee if this was a little bit longer, a little bit larger, a little bit heavier, it would perform significantly better. And I know this because I'm currently testing a Vector Continental 1:8 second focal plane with ED glass, and it performs all these tests much more competently. And it's a little bit longer and a little bit heavier. And that's the biggest thing I have with this scope. It's locked in. It forces you to use the maximum magnification to use the reticle properly, but you can't really use the reticle properly at that magnification because it's so hard to get behind. It's like, here's a beautiful, delicious steak, but you go to eat it, and it's like a piece of leather. It's just cooked way too much. It's like, oh, it looks amazing on the outside. And you play with it, and you look at it, and it smells delicious, and you lick the crust, and it's wonderful. But then it just turns to chalk in your mouth. It's like that. I said earlier that I was going to make this very heavy on the comparison between the second focal plane and first focal plane version. So guess what? Here you go. Right off the bat, you can tell that one of these is a little bit easier to pick up the reticle than the other, but only just so, and it's mostly because of the brightness of the illumination. The M8 reticle found in the first focal plane version, I think, is a tremendous reticle for a first focal plane LPVO, regardless of the magnification. But if you haven't seen my mega comparison between multiple first focal plane 1:8 and 1:10 LPVOs, this was second only to the March, and only because that had a dual reticle. But again, only by a little bit. I really love what Primary Arms did with the reticle on that, and it just works very, very effectively. I still must maintain I do prefer the Nova reticle overall because I'm a very simple kind of guy. I'm going to run a battle zero and then figure out where my drops are at distance and just figure out where the holds are and run with it. You could still do that with the M8 in the first focal plane version, but with the Nova, it's just a little bit easier at times. Another blatant difference is the illumination. The second focal plane with the Nova is stupid bright, almost too bright in most cases, whereas with the first focal plane, you really want that to have one or two more turns to the dial, but it just doesn't. However, again, in environments like this, lower light areas, it's enough, but still, I want a little bit more than enough. Personal preference aside, that's what I think everybody wants. One area where the first focal plane version is a little bit better, and you probably already saw it if you were paying really close attention, the view through the first focal plane version is a little bit larger, and we can get they're really close as far as the overall scope profiles that we could see through both of these, but I do think that the first focal plane version is like 5% smaller. Really pulling hairs at this point. But there are some differences, and that's what I have to talk about. The Eyebox is one of those areas where I was hoping that the second focal plane version would outperform the first focal plane version by a noticeable margin. When you're talking about so minor of a margin that you can't really tell, it's not a significant margin. A significant margin is like, oh wow, there's a huge difference here, like 20%. It's nowhere near that. And that's one of the problems that I have with the second focal plane version, because I was expecting it to be a lot better. The second focal plane Nova reticle does help with figuring out where the center is, because you can see the illumination all the time, but still, I would like it to be a little bit more forgiving than what it currently is. Pay very close attention to the power towers through these scopes at very close distance, that first one. On the second focal plane, you can see that it pulls to the right, whereas with the first focal plane version, everything lines up beautifully. The same thing for the power lines overhead. Like I said, the second focal plane version was a little bit harder for me to tweak for some reason. Usually first focal planes are much more challenging for me. Second focal planes are just like, again, set and forget. You get it close enough and it's usually good enough. But I found it, if I tweaked it a little bit here and there, it was hard for me to get back to exactly where I was. I did not notice that issue with the first focal plane. Once you set it, you're in that ballpark, you're in your section, you're almost at your seat. It just felt a little bit more forgiving. However, that isn't everything. The biggest issue with the first focal plane version is its rather shitty image at the higher magnifications. We've already seen how good the second focal plane is, but we haven't seen it directly side by side with the first focal plane yet. So let's really push these things out at distance and see how they perform against one another. You can very easily notice the size difference with the two of these scopes. The first focal plane is larger to look through. At 1x, it's a much more enjoyable experience for me. Might not be for you, but for me, getting behind the first focal plane version just seems a little bit more enjoyable. However, when we increase these to their maximum magnifications, there is a very clear winner. And no, it's not the first focal plane version. As we already saw with the second focal plane version on this exact same scene a couple of minutes ago, it dramatically outperforms the first focal plane version at any distance. As long as it's above 6x, the second focal plane will pull ahead, whereas the first focal plane really does turn very soft. It's great. That's all I want to see. Just a really sharp, clear image. It's fairly accurate to what we could see with the naked eye. And we get that with the second focal plane, not necessarily with the first focal plane. Just look at how muddy the image looks by the drops. That was at 500-ish yards. If we push it out further, it gets much worse. So let's say you're setting this up for a combat zero and you have to hold at 6 or so mils at distance. If you're holding at 6 or 7 mils at 800-ish yards, you're going to be looking at an image that's really fuzzy and soft at 8x. However, because it's first focal plane, you can dial back the magnification to a much more tolerable 6x, get a much more forgiving eye box, and a much sharper looking image. whereas you cannot do that with the second focal plane if you are using that reticle for holding. So it makes more sense with the first focal plane version, even though it doesn't work as well at 8x. Talk about a mind bender. Image stability on both of these optics are pretty good. I pan out with the second focal plane version first, then with the first, so this way we can see them one at a time as opposed to trying to cross your eyes and see them both at the same time. They're both good. There are much worse examples of this out there. For what they are, I really can't complain all that much. It's fine. It's fine. Would I like to see better for $1,500? Absolutely. But a lot of people aren't willing to give up size and weight for the price. These coming in at 17 or so ounces and only being 9.2 and 9.28 inches long respectively is why people buy them. Not necessarily for their optical performance. Yes, they both work really good. But when you talk about maximum limits, like hard limits, they're not at the level that I wish both of these were. But for 99.9% of you out there, they're going to function more than sufficiently enough. And that's all that really matters, right? If you're happy with it. I get so caught up in the little stuff that I have a hard time getting past it. But if you don't have that problem, well then you're going to be much happier in life because you're going to buy either of these scopes and be super impressed with how both of these perform. Again though, I would happily give up an inch in length and an ounce or two in weight to have these perform at 10% better than what they perform at, because then they would really be truly top tier. With the rant over, let's finish this side by side between these two rivaling siblings, and let's get the second focal plane version behind some lesser expensive alternatives in the second focal plane area. Again, at 100 yards on the exact same day. Tit for tat, it's the exact same story that we've seen so far. So I'm going to start skipping past this a little bit because I'm going to start sounding like a broken record, and nobody wants to hear that, not even me. I'm going to wrap a nice neat bow on this little comparison. If you're looking for maximum image quality, maximum brightness to the illumination, and that's it, you go with the second focal plane version. If you're going with a slightly more cohesive package, and I mean like single percent slightly more cohesive package, you go with the first focal plane version. However, there are way too many variables for me to understand what you're looking for in an optic to give you an exact answer of which one of these to go for. Truth be told, 99.9% of the population is going to be happy with either of these to the point where they probably will never want to sell them. So it really doesn't matter. Go with the one that you think is going to work best for you and enjoy the ever-loving crap out of it. But let's say you don't want to spend $1,500 on a second focal plane scope when there are a lot of other less expensive options out there that might perform a little bit better for you. Well, one such example that I have very good footage for is the Trijicon TR25. This is a 1:6 by 24 second focal plane LPVO. It comes in 2 ounces heavier at 19 ounces, and it comes in, get ready for this, 2 inches longer at 11 inches. That makes a dramatic difference, in my opinion, for the capacity of the glass. Whenever you make something, quote, air quotes, compact or ultra short, you're sacrificing the maximum potential of that glass by a considerable margin. Just by lengthening the scope a little bit changes the dynamics of the glass. I can't say dynamics to save my life, Jesus. It changes the dynamics of the glass so much so that it almost seems like a completely different set of lenses. The TR25 is a perfect example of a scope that I feel is the perfect set and forget optic. Its turrets are perfect because they're super easy to adjust and super easy to re-zero. They're capped. And because you're buying an AccuPoint, you have tritium-based illumination, which a lot of people aren't going to be all about, myself included. I love the ability to dial in a certain amount of illumination if I so choose. You don't have that luxury with the TR25. However, you do have the luxury of reticle options. There are a massive amount of reticles that you can option out your TR25 with, from this triangle post to a German number 4 to a mil dot. You could go with red, green, yellow illumination. The list goes on and on. It also feels like you can beat someone half to death with the thing if you run out of ammunition. It really is an optic that I think about very frequently. If there was an LPVO in the 1 to 6 and second focal plane category that I was going to purchase with my own money tomorrow, it would be really tough to choose something other than the TR25. It's $1,000. It's 50%. No, I'm sorry. It's 33% less expensive than the PLxC. Still made in Japan. Very high quality glass. Very high quality components. Very strong track record. The only issue is if you're buying it used, you have to worry about the age of the tritium, because if the tritium dies, your illumination mostly goes out the window. However, other than that, the TR25 might be one of the best set and forget LPVOs on the market. There, I said it. But see, I really want a battery-powered illuminator, and I want to save a little bit more money, but I still want a high-quality Japanese-made optic. Well, let me introduce you to the Delta Stryker HD 1 to 6 by 24. I am dyslexic tonight. For around the $800 to $850 mark, you can find these brand new, and it offers a lot of what the PLxC has to offer. It's 17.9 ounces, so just under an ounce heavier, and it's just under an inch longer at 10 inches. But as you can very clearly see, the reticle is not too dissimilar, and the illumination is also very good. I think the Nova still outshines it, all puns intended, but by a very minimal margin. The view through the Stryker is also a little bit smaller than what we see with the PLxC, but not so much so that it's going to be like looking through a straw from McDonald's as opposed to like a bubble tea straw. They're really close. Again, probably like 8 to 10%. Is it noticeable? Absolutely. But if you were to do a blind test one to the other, I guarantee you it would be a little bit harder for you to figure out which one is which. The other nice thing about the Delta is you're going to have a little bit larger Eyebox. Being a 1 to 6, it seems to be the best magnification range, or at least the maximum magnification range for a second focal plane LPVO, again, in my opinion. Despite the fact that it's only an inch or so longer, it really is a much more compelling argument when you get behind this Delta Stryker. The PLxC, again, I've talked way too much about, so I'm not going to get too involved in. But here, at 300 yards, are you really going to miss 2x? And subsequently for the TR25, are you really going to miss what 2x can offer when you're gaining so much more capacity with the optic overall as opposed to just magnification? I don't think you really are. The Delta Stryker is a wonderful option. But what happens if you wanted to save even more money? What happens if you wanted everything that the PLxC has to offer, but for a fraction of the price? The PLxC's biggest issue is its little brother, the SLx NOVA. The SLx NOVA has only one flaw: its image stability at the in-between magnifications. Between 2 to 3x, it's very wishy-washy. The image looks greasy when you get perfectly off-center. But that's it. For the $300-ish that the SLx goes for, you can buy 5 of them for one PLxC. They're only about an ounce heavier and only about an inch and a quarter longer. So it's not like it's going to be a massive difference. Sure, the SLx's are made in China. Both PLxCs are made in Japan. That's going to sway people one way or the other. And I can't argue with that. I love things that are made in Japan. I love things that are made anywhere other than China. But China nowadays can and does produce very nice looking optics, and ones that have very good controls. In fact, a lot of the controls from the SLx are directly derived from the DNA from the PLxC. So it's not like you're getting a scope that has shitty controls. Sure, the materials are nowhere near as nice to touch. You can tell the SLx is more tinny, whereas the PLx seems like it's much more of a thud because it's made out of much better materials. But if you're going strictly on image capacity, illumination capacity, controls capacity, and its overall just ability to function as an inexpensive LPVO, how could you look away from the SLx? How could you not even consider it, even if you're trying to do a higher end build? The only reason why I picked the PST Gen 2 over the SLx was the in-between magnification. But other than that, the price point alone, you can get SLx NOVA for almost half the price of the PST. And I mentioned that in that comparison. I'm willing to pay a little bit extra to get what I feel is a little bit more performance. You're paying a lot extra for the PLxC, but raw performance-wise, I don't think you're really getting that much more. Many of you might think that I had a brain aneurysm and I'm talking crazy talk, but it's true. The SLx is a wonderful performing optic. The PLxC in second focal plane is a wonderful performing optic. Hell, so is the first focal plane version. But for the price, I was expecting a little bit more. I was expecting a real knockout. But unfortunately, it still has some of the quirkiness of the first focal plane version without the benefits of being in the first focal plane. And that's my biggest gripe with it. I'm going to end this video because I've been talking for way too long. I'm going to sum it up like this. I reached out to the CEO of Primary Arms after I had gotten this and had it for a while, and I said, do you have any plans on making a 1:6 PLxC in second focal plane? The exact same scope. Basically the SLx, but made in Japan. And they said no. They didn't see the need. It was very disappointing to hear that, because I really do think that they would be able to topple kings in this segment. The Razer HD Gen 2. The only reason why I haven't rolled in one of those in a direct comparison is because I don't have any good enough footage to really roll it. And that was a very long time ago. I've streamlined my setup infinitely more than how that was in just a few years. But things like the Razer HD Gen 2, things like the Delta Stryker, the Credo HX, the TR25, a lot of those optics would really feel like the PLxC is not only nipping at their heels, but maybe even just hitting them head on. As it is right now, I think the 1:8 magnification range is best served in first focal plane for the reasons that I've already talked about. It's a little bit more dynamic. I think if you're going to make a second focal plane LPVO, 1:6 is really the sweet spot. There are some optics I touched on. The Vector Continental, I don't have any footage for it. I'm still running preliminary testing on it. But it's very compelling. But it's larger and heavier than the PLxC. But yet it seems a little bit better sorted as far as being able to get behind it. And as far as illumination goes, guess what? The Vector's right behind the Nova. But with all that being said, if you buy this, if you own it and you enjoy it, great. I'm very happy for you, because everything that I'm complaining about really isn't going to matter that to many people. In fact, to me, Primary Arms is going to let me keep the scope. I'll probably run it on a couple of rifles, and I'll enjoy it when I do it. But I'll still be complaining about those little minutia pieces, because if you can hit perfection, why not go for it? Why not go for it? Anyway, a huge thank you for all of you for staying tuned. Yes, Primary Arms did send this in, did tell me to keep it, just like with the first focal plane version, but I gave this thing as honest a review, as blatant and as blunt as possible, because like all of you, I am a consumer and I want to be told exactly what your experiences are. I love talking to people online, in person, like, hey, what do you think about this? What are your thoughts? And they look at me like, they cock their head like a bird and go, why do you want to know? It's like, because I genuinely am curious. I love to know what people think. I love to know what people are looking for, what drives them to one decision versus the other. Because I think as a person in the space, it's important for me to understand that, so this way I can relay the information that people want, so this way they can make a more informed and better decision. Yeah, that's it. And on that bombshell, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for watching. And as always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.